So let me look at our schedule where we are. We are module 13, December 2nd. There's your text to read. I apologize that it's divvied up in 3 parts. I don't know how that happened. That's how the library photocopied it for me. And I noticed that the section you had was lacking footnotes, so I took the liberty of including them there at the bottom. Here in my arrow, so if there's any, this text you read for today has a really strange way of citing the quotes. I don't know if you noticed. The quotes don't have any footnotes, but if you go to the back of the book, this is the book, by the way. And if you go to the back of the book, it has the quotes referenced by page number. The quotes are referenced by page number. It's easily the most inefficient way of doing this. Sorry, it's sideways, but y'all can, here we go. Here you go. So the footnotes are by page number. So if you see a quote you're interested in, you want to know where to find it, go to this footnotes section that I've added here and look for the page number where you find the quote, and then that'll tell you the reference, okay? Let's see. This is our last reading assignment in this class for this week. Next week, I'll be having final paper conferences with you all. I emailed this to you all just a little while ago, and some of you already signed up for some spots, which is perfectly great. If you have any issues at all with these available times, let me know and I will see what I can do, okay, to be flexible for you. And then, of course, 2 weeks from today, your final papers will be due by the end of the day. I know that I indicated I'd be holding paper conferences for the whole week next week, but I've scheduled them all for the 9th, and if you want to meet with me again, that's fine. Let me see if there's anything I should tell you here. I think I'm just going to talk to you all this way. So about your final papers, I've heard from some of you. I need to hear from everybody. Definitely by the time we meet next week, I'd like an email from you, what you're thinking about writing about. It doesn't have to be definitive. It does not have to be set in stone or formal. It can be, you can say, listen, I have a couple options and I'd like to know which ones are most productive or profitable. And I can tell you. Okay. And so I need to hear from you. By next week, email me. During our paper conferences next week, there's a couple things we're going to talk about. We are going to talk about, of course, your research. So therefore, knowing what your topic is or having a good idea about it by the time we meet is very important. If you have an outline, that is super too. I can help you flesh out your paper verbally. We can, see what the body and the organization will look like. Research, we can look for certain research options. I can go through some of the databases with you that I think are good for you, and we can try out certain terms. We can talk about writing. If you have 2 other papers in this class that I've graded, and if you have any comments or questions, this is a good time for us to go over those. Some of you, I have indicated that I want you to visit, work with a tutor from the writing studio for these final papers. I will look to see that you do. I receive notification from Michelle Glenn, who is the director of the writing studio. I received notification from her when my students make appointments. So those of you who I've asked to make appointments, you know who you are. I expect that you will, okay? And you need to do that sooner rather than later because the writing studio tends to get quite busy this time of year, although I do believe they may have expanded their roster of tutors. I think I heard some rumblings about that. Okay, let me pause for a second. See what questions you all have about the final papers, the conferences, anything like that. Does anybody have any questions?
Can I talk to you this week? Like just for a little bit after class?
Sure. You
Okay.
can email me, or if you meet after class, you can. Gia is going to talk to me for a little bit after class, but we can also chat as well. Yeah, I mean, listen, if you want to set up an appointment to talk to me, it's very easy because of Zoom. So just email me and we can arrange time to talk. Other questions? I still would like an email from you regardless, because then I have a record of what your topic is when we meet or what you're thinking about. Okay. All right. Let's see. The other thing I wanted to tell you is, so next week, we will not have class at a regularly appointed time. I will be meeting with each of you individually in your appointed slots. Okay. I'm just going to hang out on Zoom all day, and you pop in and we'll chat and do our thing, and then you go away and the next person comes in. And I'm happy to, meet again if you would like at a later date or beforehand, like Nicole says. The week after, which is, I believe, December 16th, right, is our last class meeting. I would like to convene one more time here on Zoom at the appointed time, just to review the class, how it went, your impressions, your concerns, your observations, your recommendations, and the like. Okay, just a general session where we can catch up and go over a couple things. Okay. All right. That's all I need to say by way of introduction. Anybody have any questions about any of this stuff? Okay. Very good. So today we're going to talk about Amitav Ghosh, his book, The Great Derangement, which I had you read for today. I've had you read the final section of that book. I don't know if anybody knows Amitav Ghosh. He is an Indian. He's from India. He is a fiction author. And I will admit I have not read his fiction. I'm not a big fiction reader. I read nonfiction. I lose patience with fiction. So I have not read his fiction writing. It is highly recommended. He's a very acclaimed writer, and if you're intrigued and interested, then I recommend you look at it for sure. I like this text for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's an interesting take on climate change, which is an intractable political problem, which I wanted to make sure we spent some time discussing in this class. Climate change looks like it might be the premier political challenge of your generation. And interestingly, it looks like it might be the major cause that President Biden will take up. And we can talk about that as well. There have been some interesting commentaries written about his plans to tackle this issue. But from a political standpoint, it is a pressing issue. It's also unique, and it's also incredibly difficult. Um, we've been building up to this issue of climate change as we have worked through Rebecca Solnit and Jenny Odell, who has some really interesting points about ecological thinking, which I think is very valuable. And Ghosh has a different approach here and a different take. The other reason I liked this text is because he's an artist. And as a fiction writer, not a visual artist, literary artist, but he is interested in what artists can do. Not very expansively. His comments aren't very expansive, but he gives some tantalizing hints about the role that artists can do and why they're so important in this debate. And so I want to get into that issue. Let me just start. Well, let's. Well, actually, let me put it back to you all for a second. See, does anybody have any comments or questions or observations about this reading you'd like to share or ask? All right. Well, then, I'm going to open it up with a very general question. I kind of made a claim a second ago that maybe, I don't know if you feel that I'm justified in making. Is climate change the premier political issue of your generation? Do you agree with that statement?
I think people have been talking about it for a while, but it just becomes more pressing as it gets closer and closer to being irreversible.
Good. Maybe more of my question, put it this way. Does it make you feel anxious?
Yes.
Rashad says yes. Sarah says yes. More, less anxious than other issues? Mason says she is terrified.
It's like
I think it's like the main reason why I like pay attention to politics.
Wow. Okay. Rashad, you were saying?
oh, I was gonna say it's more terrifying because it's like those movies where it's like, oh, the world is in trouble, but it's true, you know? It's like it actually could happen. Well, I mean, it is happening. So.
Okay. Anybody else? What is so terrifying about it? Mason says she is terrified. What is terrifying? Sarah is scared she's going to lose New Orleans.
I think what's so scary about it for me is that we can't solve it as individuals. And the people who have the most power in this world have the most to do with it, but they won't give up their power. So it's like a fight that's going nowhere.
Okay, so the seeming inaction is also troubling. Good. Anybody else? Anybody think that people are not worried enough? You know what I mean? Like, I'm sitting here trying to think, how worried am I really? Part of
Yeah,
it
I
is,
think
of course.
It's so
yeah,
abstract, and I don't like people just don't have the. Often it feels like people, uh, like maybe like regular people, like normie people, like don't really possess the sort of ability to abstractualize concepts and to think beyond, right? And they like to sort of put like their decisions sort of in the hands of others. It could be like, for example, 401k. Like most people like who are creating one have no idea what's going on and who's managing the 401k behind it. They just want to know that like somebody else is doing it for future action.
Mm,
Just like short, like I think it's like sort of inherent human nature, which is like there's like just the short term surviving next week, surviving next month. You know, I think that like people who I think that like the people that are smart often possess or just the ability to think beyond like and not even just be more clever but just to abstractualize beyond themselves.
Yeah, I think that climate change is especially something that like tends to lean into that like out of sight, out of mind mentality. Like the reason that I think about it more often is because like I am from New Orleans and we were raised like learning every year about how our shorelines need like more sediment and how like the waters rising will directly affect our city. And like we see the floods when the rain comes, like when it's physically in front of you, that's when people are going to like have more of a reaction. And so most of the world isn't exactly seeing like such strong physical changes in their own lives. So it's hard to get like a kind of like a unified voice for it.
I guess also because many people still think it's not like our problem to be concerned of, because I guess climate change is not like a really like a happen like in a second. It sort of like grows regularly. Many still even think that climate change is like still a conspiracy,
mm,
and also there also climate change doesn't like it's not like happen in like a short time.
mm,
So like many people I guess they just don't care that much, and because it's not like literally it's not like the problem of our generations, because when the actual damage is done, it's probably gonna be like a 200 years later. Like many things, it's not it's it's like a future problem to be solved, not like a current problem to be solved.
that's great. Thank you so much, Gloria. Um, yeah, just summing up some of what you guys are saying here. Um, you know, I agree with Gabriel. I think there's something about this issue, as I started out by saying, this is climate change is a very unique political issue. It's a uniquely troubling political issue. Um, it's not like, other pressing political issues. I'm thinking of like, you know, maybe gun violence or racial politics. Um, it's even more troubling and more difficult, if you can imagine, than those issues because of, in a strange way, it is abstract. It is kind of abstract, right? And it is debatable. And I'm listening to Sarah here talk about New Orleans, and I hear everything she's saying, and then I realize that the majority of the citizens in Louisiana don't even believe in climate change, right? So, these events are happening, but do people believe that they are what they are, right? Um, and and this issue has been brought up before, but the climate is a nebulous. The climate is a nebulous object, right? So you always used to hear, well, one of the things I used to hear is, Republican senators would come on and say, well, it's snowing in Houston, right? Tell me about climate change. It's snowing in Houston. As if that's supposed to refute climate change.
The one senator who brought a snowball onto the Senate floor.
Yeah.
Oh, that was great.
Yeah, I know. Like, talking about climate change, and then all these scientists had to say, well, there's a difference between the weather and climate, blah, 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 and it's what seems so to one person seems different to another, right? So this really is a beast.
I want to add another thing too. Is I think in a world where we constantly see technology changing and advancing, And really, if you think about it, the amount of the population that is actually even being accredited towards these advancements, like who is like how much percentage of the population is actually in STEM fields pursuing these things, right? There's this like ultimate deference to like the scientist or engineers as this sort of the as sort of that sort of class of people will sort of solve the issue, right? By
Yes.
the time it gets too
That's
bad.
Mm.
And in a way, like it's totally logic's totally understandable. Like 20 years ago, the idea of just having like a device like this
Mm.
would be it's Star Trek level shit.
Mm.
Um, uh, but this is like uniquely not the case. Like how many people have like really like how many people in the country? I think like really like not like isn't it like 30% of the country has ever traveled in a plane before? It's
Oh, I
it's
don't know.
it's actually like a significantly low number,
Mm.
right? But like if you travel on a plane, even a short plane ride, like you start to be like, damn, like this plane ride is only 3 hours, and like you see so much of the Earth, and then you can actually get like you could start to picture how big the Earth is,
Mm.
right? But you know,
So you're saying we should put everybody on a plane? That's what you're
I
saying.
I think that is partially a solution. Actually, is government funded plane rides,
Me included.
sightseeing tours.
Um, good. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Very good. Well, let's. I think this is. Oh, Gia, go for it.
That actually brings up something really interesting, I think, where I actually was behind on last week's assignment, so I did this week's and last week's today. And like that whole thing of, well, maybe everybody has to see the world to take responsibility and understand it. It definitely seems like bioregionalism plays into this idea of solving climate change. If everybody understood where they were living, if everybody cared about their surroundings and observed them and actually took note of them changing, maybe they would care.
Yeah. Thank you, Gia. I raised that. Yeah, I was sharing with you all a quote last week, last time we met, which I think is again valuable. It's a quote by Naomi Klein, who's a very important environmental activist, and she's responding to this problem. And the problem of climate change is evidence, right? Where is the compelling evidence? What is the compelling evidence? As Gabriel Ches and others have pointed out, when people finally have evidence before them to say, oh yeah, climate change is happening, it might be too late, right? But, most people are not convinced by the evidence, or not most, a lot. In America, it's a lot. As Ghosh points out, it's a lot in the Anglosphere, the English-speaking world. A lot of people don't believe in the evidence they see. And Naomi Klein makes a point that I believe Jenny Odell would agree with, which is the reason we don't know how to recognize the evidence is because we don't pay attention to our environment in the same way that we once did. And Naomi Klein talks about like earlier agrarian societies. You would have known when your local stream froze over. You would have known when your pond was supposed to freeze over. You would have known when certain crops emerged. Now we're divorced from all that. We don't even know when this is supposed to happen. And of course, the point that Naomi Klein makes, which is valuable for Jenny Odell, is that a lot of this information, everybody, is intergenerational, right? When I'm talking about agrarian society, these are societies that would have been more rooted in the land from generation to generation, which is why I was making a big deal in our last class meeting about the high mobility of American life in particular. Americans move a lot from town to town, region to region. We move from Arizona to New England to the Northwest to Florida. Do we really know what the natural calendar is in any of those places? We're not around long enough to become clued in, right? But if we would, then we would notice these differences. I'm going to share an example with you of something that really struck me. I don't know if I know I shared this one of my classes. I don't know if I did here. Did I tell you all about the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh? Does that sound familiar now? Anybody in this class from Pittsburgh? Okay. Anyway, if you ever have a chance, Pittsburgh has a great museums, and they have a very interesting natural history museum funded by the same Carnegie who funded all the arts and music institutions. And they had an exhibit when I went, and this was last 2 summers ago. My son was looking at colleges up there, so we went, and they had flowers that they had picked and dried from the same region of Western Pennsylvania. And they compared them to the same flowers picked a century before. And they revealed the date at which those flowers had bloomed. And a century ago, those flowers bloomed a full month later than they were blooming now. Okay. How does evidence like that become real and relevant to people, right? This is the question for Jenny Odell, right? What would it take for that kind of evidence to become noticeable to you and pressing, right? Gia, you had your hand up again?
Yeah, actually, we were discussing this. I was discussing this with one of my bosses just yesterday, actually. I think they were just joking, like, oh, who enjoyed like the climate change over the weekend, you know, the last bit of like some warm weather again. And I got into discussing like, well, being from New Jersey too, it seems like every time I go home, it snows in Baltimore, and then when I'm here, it snows in Jersey, and I'm always missing the snow. And that's just something that I've been noticing. But then I got into this like observation that I've held for a while, that is when Sandy happened, I forget what year that was.
Hurricane Sandy, for everybody.
Yeah, Hurricane Sandy hit New Jersey really bad. And
I think it was 2013. Obama.
I want to say, yeah, 2013 or 2012, probably 2013 or something. But yeah, it hit New Jersey really bad. And I personally was out of power for almost 2 weeks, but we were still having to go to school and like do homework and stuff. And that was just a weird time because everybody was living at their families' houses. But point aside, as a younger kid, me and all my friends were worried about Halloween. And like, oh, we're gonna get to go trick-or-treating because it happened at the end of September, I believe. And I remember not only did they cancel Halloween because, you know, the danger behind lurking around neighborhoods that have no power as young kids, but then also a snowstorm happened, and it was in October. So that is like how I remember kind of what the weather was like, because like such a crazy event happened at the time. It was literally like Sandy, giant snowstorm. Everybody was just like kind of freaking out a little bit. And yeah, that's the one thing that solidified what the weather was like when I was younger. And since then, it has not snowed in October. And that was over, like, how math, what is that? 7 years, 8 years? And, you know, it's December, it still hasn't snowed in New Jersey, just like Baltimore, where it used to be that it definitely was snowing in New Jersey before it was in Baltimore, which is kind of strange to notice.
Yeah, I mean, I often try to think about my own lifetime, whether I have noticed changes. I've been in Baltimore my whole life, and I can't really think of any, you know, but that's the thing about climate is like, it's not even necessarily something you should recognize or register, you know, the changes in the climate. It's not something you should be registering within a couple of years or a couple of decades. This variance is over a longer period of time, unfortunately. And that's one of the reasons it makes this very politically slippery and troubling. And I wanted to speak to what Gloria is saying here. You know, Gloria raised a point earlier that I forgot to acknowledge, which is, you know, this issue of whose problem is it? you know, I'm definitely in that boat. Like, I get worried about climate change, and I'm like, Jesus Christ, there's only so much I can do. I hope we'll be bailed out. And Gabriel mentions also the technological fixes that, fingers crossed, might be coming. Amitov Ghosh doesn't talk about them much. He references them in the Paris Climate Agreement, and he notes that in the Paris Climate Agreement, the people who wrote it are like, they put a lot of stock in these future fixes, right? Will be bailed out by technology. And I'm happy to talk about that if anybody's interested, you know, what those fixes might be. But, you know, from a moral and political standpoint, if we get bailed out, that might not be super, you know. It doesn't really get to the main issues we're talking about here. It means we can continue with our bad behavior, right? So a little bit of an unrelated topic, but I'm happy to dive in if anybody wants to. But more to the point of what Gloria is getting at here in the chat as well later on is, you know, what kind of, you know, politicians, you know, I'm trying to think, there's some countries where politicians are facing up to this, but there's many politicians who are not. There are many politicians who are not, you know, inspired to act on this, in part because the action would require, the actions that address climate change require are unpopular, and because there doesn't seem to be popular mobilization underneath behind this issue, especially when it comes to, like, in democracies, you know, we're talking about, even in countries that are not democracies, you know, the will of the people is very important, of course, right? So I'm putting in the chat here, this is a quote from Amitav Ghosh, and I'm not sure exactly where, I think 128, 129. He says that climate change fails to grip the political imaginary. Climate change fails to grip the political imaginary, which is his way of saying that, yeah, it's not something people find it easy to rally around. Gloria says we're just going to die anyway, so. Okay. Well, we might have
It's
children.
like I at least got to see the polar bears in my lifetime, so.
Well,
There's a topic which is also very interesting to me when people talk about climate change, at least here in Panama, that it's like you can tell there's something going on. Like we were just hit by 2 hurricanes back to back, and it was pretty bad, and everything's changing, and the corals are dying, and so people talk also about how the oceans are rising because the islands in the Caribbean are starting, in the Pacific are starting to, like, the water is supposedly rising, right? But then if you look to the old part of the city, the ocean is going down away. So people talk about, so like in the news, everyone's talking about climate change, but it's not that. It's that the plates underneath the ground are turning Panama a little bit sideways. So one side is going up and one side is going down. And that's why the side that's on one side of the ocean is getting higher, and then the side that's on the other side of the ocean is getting lower. So I also think a lot about how much, like, we know climate change is happening, but how much do we know about what is happening and what is like fake news? And then because the government doesn't address any of it, it's like everyone's just throwing out theories and nobody really knows what's going on.
Pretty sure we do know what's going on. There's so much science written out. I think it's more that, like, that's not accessible to us.
well, there's two issues there. The language of science, you know, scientists are not politicians. And the language of science, this is an eternal political and philosophical problem. The language of science is not the language of politics. This is not the stuff. I dealt with this extensively in my book I wrote about guns. There's an abundance of data out there showing that, guns everywhere is a bad idea, but it's not politically translatable, and same, the climate scientists can say what they will. I think we see this with COVID-19. The public health people have issuing all these very logical statements, but they don't translate politically. And Ghosh kind of gets to that at the very beginning when he says that climate change poses a challenge to the most important political idea, which is freedom. Climate change is anti-freedom in a way. Good Lord, how the hell are you going to get people to rally in favor of something that is against the idea of freedom, right? Let me say this also. Nicole's comment makes me think of this. We are starting to see a lot of evidence of climate change and the turmoil of climate change, but mostly in the developing world, unfortunately. There are islands in the Pacific that have flooded. There are nations there that have had to repopulate their entire populations. They've had to remove them. The coral reefs, the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, I was reading recently, about a third of it is bleached now. And bleaching is a result of rising water temperatures. There was a very long expose in the Atlantic last month about Central America, how the migrant crisis on our border is driven in many ways by climate change. There are parts of Guatemala and Honduras that are becoming, you cannot farm them anymore because they are being so damaged by climate change. The Syrian civil war, which is already quite old, was spawned largely by climate change. There was a tremendous drought, right? What have we been told? We've been told that climate change is going to spawn great geopolitical turmoil in terms of migration and maybe even civil wars as people lose resources and fight over dwindling resources and have to move. We're seeing that kind of geopolitical stuff, which is evidence of the climate change that is happening. So it's happening. But what really sucks is this is happening in the developing world. This is happening in those countries which are not principally responsible. We are, right? The United States is the biggest emitter on the planet. Maybe not anymore, but until very recently it was. And consider again that we're only 300 million people out of 7.5 billion. So we're champs when it comes to consumption, right? We're a very bad example. But the industrialized North looks like it will largely get away with climate change and do well, right? As the climate warms and different parts of the planet become arable, that means you can farm them. That means the farmland is going to migrate north. That means that'll migrate into Canada. That means parts of Russia are going to be able to be farmed further north, right? The whole swath across the middle of the globe is going to be much hotter. And so that leads to the kind of moral conundrum that Ghosh is talking about. But let's get into this issue because, about freedom, which Rashad is highlighting here, that issue, he says, climate change poses a challenge to the most important political idea, freedom. How does climate change pose a challenge to freedom?
I think that like people think freedom maybe like is the freedom to choose to choose the next option, to choose how you can change things. But it also freedom is the freedom to choose not to want to move, not to want to have to change one's job, not to conform to something else. And so for everybody who's compromised on the coast, who doesn't have the resources or means, that is taking away their freedom, right? Despite being able to say, well, yeah, they have the free to move off the coast. Well, that's not, you know.
Okay, good. Yeah, I mean, just so we're all clear, I mean, Amitav Ghosh does not endorse this. He doesn't actually think that climate change challenges freedom, but he thinks that this is how it's perceived. And this is part of the reason why it's hard to rally around this idea or keep people committed to it. How is he understanding freedom in this sense? What kind of freedom does it challenge? What kind of freedom does climate change challenge?
I think it might be because, like, in order to like prevent climate change, that people have to do certain things. Probably is gonna affect their jobs or their normal lives, and they just think, oh, don't tell me what I should need to do, or don't take that from me. So they feel like they're being challenged.
Good. I love it. That's excellent. Can anybody expand on that? What kind of freedom does climate change challenge? How does it make
It challenges the capitalistic freedom.
Exactly.
Right? That's the only answer.
Which is what? I mean, what is wrong with the capitalistic notion of freedom, according to Amitav Ghosh?
Well, capitalism is the freedom to pursue the growth of capital in the name, right? By any means necessary, right? So any infringement on by any means necessary is for capitalism, like infringement on freedom, right? So yeah, climate change restricts how you can do emissions and have to recapture the emissions, but also restriction on capitalistic freedom may be the like child labor laws. That is restricting capitalistic freedom, but people can't really can't draw the same connection between things like child labor laws as an infraction and okay with blocking that and, climate change.
Why is capitalism appealing to voters? Or I should say, what is appealing about it? Money? For who? For me, right? Ghosh points out that at the heart of capitalist theory, and this is exactly how Adam Smith, the founder of the father of capitalism, how he spelled it out, at the center of it is individualism, right? In fact, there's debates about how to read Adam Smith, but the laissez-faire camp of capitalism, I think we've discussed this group, the modern day neoliberals in a way, but they're the ones, this is the people who read capitalism and lost a Rolex, okay.
That was literally my dream.
Okay.
I was devastated in the dream and then I woke up.
There you go. Okay. You have a capitalist dream. What was I going to say? Right. For Adam Smith suggests, and this is a subject of debate, but he suggests in The Wealth of Nations back in late 1700s, he makes a suggestion that if you want to advance the common, that there is actually an opposition between the individual good and the common good, that they're opposed to one another in this sense, that if you try to be like selfless and pursue the common good, you will fail, right? Or the public good, the public welfare will not be as benefited by if you are selfishly invested, right, in pursuing your own goods. Essentially, Adam Smith believes in the powerful motor and mobilization of selfishness. And he says that if everyone in society just seeks their own, right? You just go out and seek your own, they will indirectly, and this is the famous quote, as if by an invisible hand, lift everybody else. What does that mean? That means that at the heart of capitalism is the individual and individual pursuits. The whole system, the whole economy flourishes to the extent that everybody is out for themselves and working like a devil to get that boat, to get that car, to get that plum house. You know what I mean? The more that everybody focuses on that, indirectly, the public welfare will be raised more effectively than if we were selfless. Okay.
I made a joke about the holy ghost being the invisible hand of the market, but it is worth noting that like inherent in sort of American religion, right? Especially the popularity of Protestantism and different offsets of Protestantism. Protestantism prizes this sort of idea of like work, the work ethic, right? And that a man exalts himself through working and working hard, and which and there's a great book on this, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism by Max Weber,
Yep.
published like in 1905. It was recognizing this.
Yeah.
But that type of like spirit, this sort of hard working, has really been bastardized, right? We only get 12 days of vacation a year on average for Americans. In
Yeah.
Europe, they get 25 to 30 days.
Yeah.
And then it also, like most Americans during that 12 days have to check in with their office at some point. So, it's so deeply linked back to religion. Like, no, we're not like a white Christian country, but all that stuff is so enmeshed in it.
Well,
The
how
work
many?
hard, the grind, the struggle, like all these words that we use, right? Dolly Parton's 9 to 5, man. Like,
Well, now
it's all there.
Nobody now it's 9 to 7, right? 9 to 5 is the old days. The work days increased since then. Well, I'll put a religious spin on it and pose the question to everybody. How do you often feel guilty when you're not working? Because I do. I always feel guilty when I'm not working, And I know, by the way, you all work so hard at this college that you probably feel the same way, Yeah, work is our religion. In America, it is, at least. By the way, that's such an interesting little book by Max Weber. I'm actually teaching it in the spring in my capitalism class. It's very interesting. Right, keep working or get left behind, right? And digital technology has made this so much worse, right? Now you have no excuse. I was in a meeting the other day. Let me tell you all how sad it's gotten. I was in a meeting the other day on Zoom. One of the people in the meeting had to go pick up her kid from somewhere. She switched from Zoom on her computer to Zoom on her phone and propped it in her car and drove to pick up her kid. I'm sorry. That just like broke my heart. When that happens to me, I'm be like, peace out. I gotta go. I'm gonna go get my kid. I'll come back. We can't. Now we have no excuse. We can work everywhere. And I'm hearing this sense from you all too, like this semester, right? The overall sense I'm getting from this semester online, as many of you put it, is that there is no neat boundary now between off time and on time, right? The unique stress of this semester is that you all feel like you're working all the time. Yeah. Okay. Maybe some of you agree with me, maybe not so much. Okay. By the way, it's been a while since I saw this study. But the more you work, like bigger, like larger work weeks, that is correlated to a bigger carbon footprint. Any idea why?
Is it because of driving?
Driving? I don't know.
Would it have to do anything with almost if you are running out of time, you're maybe like buying into corporations more, like food that's already made for you or something? Does that have correlation to a higher carbon footprint?
Maybe. I think the way to think about it is if you think about why working less would decrease or diminish your carbon impact, right? Related to what you're saying, Gia, yeah, I have more time. That means I have more time to cook for myself, and I have more time to be thoughtful about the things I eat, and I have more time to, buy healthy foods. And in the world where I have to rush, yeah, I have to go through a drive-through, or it's more tempting to go through drive-throughs to buy convenience products and convenience foods.
Or even just like food aside, I guess what you're saying with like more time, obviously, then you can give more energy and more attention to everything you consume, including like materials and plastics and things like that.
I mean, I think there is a direct correlation between so I don't know if I've mentioned to you all, there is a sociologist who uses the word, she uses the term time poverty. Oh, poverty, whoops. She says in America, we suffer from time poverty. And it's true. Like, if you compare to other industrialized nations, Gabriel pointed it out, like we work like dogs. The average work week in France is 35 hours.
Damn.
Right? What do they do with all their time? That's my first question. Like, I'm anxious just thinking about it. Like, what do they do? What are they going to do?
They protest. That's what they do with all their time.
They what? What?
They protest.
They protest. They go on strike. I know.
Right.
They sit in cafes.
It's actually no. They actually do 40 hours a week. But if you take the average time that they spend on strike, it comes out to 35.
I think it's probably their hour-long lunch break with a bottle of wine. I'm only half joking. If you think, I mean, I spent some time in Spain, and they have a very civilized lunch there, which really, that's the model. But again, like, I'm anxious thinking of like, what would I do with all my free time? I'm so programmed to work all the time. But we suffer, back to the point Gia's raising, we suffer from time poverty in this country. We work long hours, we commute long hours. Rashad mentions cars. I think the death of the commute is probably premature. I know Zoom has killed it off for a little while, the COVID has, but we'll be back, right? In some fashion. And it's crazy how people have been driving, and commutes of an hour each way are not uncommon, right? So you spend 2 hours in a car, or in New York City, an hour and a half on a train each way. Exhaustion leads to consumption, right? When you are tired, what do you have time to do at the end of the day? You come home, you flip on the TV, you might be in the mood to shop, right? But time, yeah, I mean, this is not something it's something you have to think about more broadly and more carefully. But yeah, I mean, when you have more time, that radically reorients your day and your schedule, and you have to think differently and behave differently. And I can see how that would lead to different degrees of consumption, and in particular, lower degrees of consumption. I mean, I'll put it this way: the French are not watching TV all day, right? And you may have heard. I'm not going to put the French on a pedestal. I'm the last person to do that, but you may have heard the French. They like their cheese and their wine and their sausage and their meats and their pate. And their health indicators are a lot better than ours, right? A few years ago, my wife had a book. I don't know if any of you heard of it. It's called Why French Women Don't Get Fat. And part of the reason is, well, they don't sit in their car all day, and they will walk places and drive places, and they generally, yes, they will not skip indulging, but they also eat more balanced meals and they put more time into it. We don't do that, All right, let's see here. Gabriel says it's embedded in a lot of Latin countries that party until 6 a.m. Okay. I wasn't really thinking about that, but I believe.
Yeah, we need more club culture. That's what we're missing. Bring a little bit of Florida out to every state.
I was
a little bit,
thinking
Gabriel.
that
It's
so
very
much
deep.
my first year of college. I was like, yeah, I used to go dancing Thursdays, Fridays, and sometimes even Saturdays. And all like my friends, because I used to go to UCSB, they were like, oh, I've never been clubbing. And I was like, but what have you been doing with all your weekends, all of your teenage years?
Yeah.
Like,
And what were they doing?
What were you guys doing? Like, were you at home? Were you like, I don't think
What did
when
they
I'm
say?
here. Oh, yeah.
Were they
They were,
working?
like, hanging out
Oh,
at their homes between each other, or like a lot of them, like, well, when I'm at college, like at Micah, I stay in most of the weekends. But here, even if I have the same amount of work, I'm not gonna stay in a Friday night because because nobody's gonna stay in a Friday night, so I'm not gonna do it. I'll just do it all on Sunday, I guess, and like cram it all together. But when I'm at school, both of my roommates are at home, so I'm like, okay, I'll stay home.
yeah. How
This is
many of
this is the way.
How many of you work on weekend evenings?
Like I have never done that before I went to the US.
Well, some people are indicating they do here, which, look, I'm your professor and I want you to work hard, but I agree with Nicole. I mean, it's that's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that you work on weekend evenings, but I mean, part of it is, listen, in America, work is a drug. We're workaholics. We get off on this. I don't know if you're yet at that age where you can see that or appreciate that, but you know, that is work for many Americans. Work is entertainment, and for many, it's not. Okay, let me just be absolutely clear. For many, it's not, but for many, it is. You get caught up, and you get caught up in ambition, and you get caught up in the thrill, and that is exciting and pleasant. But I think Jenny Odell points to another way of living, which is, where we make time. It's very important for us to make time, um, because that kind of sensibility is what is necessary, um, to help us change. It help us become ecologically sensitive citizens. Um, and I'm hoping, of course, that if people have time, they will not spend it locked up inside on their devices or on televisions, but walking, spending time outdoors. I know this sounds so idealistic, but that really is the key. I mean, in European communities have been built for casual walking. We haven't done that, which is a real shame. But in any case, I'm going off there on something. Does anybody else have any other questions or comments? Anybody want to chime in on time poverty or workaholics or anything? Anybody feel that I characterized you all wrongly?
Um, I was gonna say, like what you said about like working on the weekends. Like I used to work retail, and I would say like that was like when I was like I guess living for the weekend per se. But then like it got to a point where like I was working weekends as well, and it was like, well, if the weekends is supposed to be my off time,
Yeah.
to relax and what it like I'm just really working. And then like but you were right, like saying like we kind of it's like our drug, like working, because like if I didn't want to come in or like if there was like an extra day someone called out, I'm like, oh, like you don't want to come in, like why not? Like you're trying to make you feel guilty about like not working. It's like want to relax, you know?
Thanks, Rashad. Let me just be clear, though. I was principally referring to the work you do as artists, but I know that, I mean, you guys, a lot of you have to work 2 jobs, and um, maybe I'm wrong in presuming this, Rashad, but I assume that you find your, you know, your artwork is uniquely like fulfilling, right? And uniquely thrilling, like, and you're also kind of competing against each other here, right, at Micah. So, that drives you along, right?
I don't think it's a workaholic problem, because like here, even if you like there's a lot of people who are also like very into like work, but it's like, okay, I have a business meeting, but it's Friday, so let's go to a bar and we talk about it at the bar.
Yeah.
Or like, okay, it's Wednesday, but it's a nice day, let's go to our cafe, and then we have the meeting at the cafe. So it's like,
That sounds pretty good.
I guess it's just a very cultural thing.
Yeah. Well, it goes back to the point, which has been, this has been exacerbated right now under Zoom, but we have been building up in our culture, we're building up in this tendency where we overlap, recreation and work, right? They mix in, and increasingly there's less of a hard boundary between them,
It's because the US is very serious sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't like we're not so even big companies here, they tend not to be as formal as some companies in the US that I've seen. I mean, I've not spent a lot of time in companies in the US, but the ones that I've seen are like scary, like very serious, and everyone's very punctual. Like,
well, I'll give you an example. I have a very good friend who is a CEO of a company, and he spent time in Spain for several years in Barcelona. And he's American, and he had a lot of interesting insights about the different work culture. I'm like you. I have not worked in another country. I've always worked in the United States, although I've studied and lived abroad. But he told me he had an interesting dilemma when he got to Barcelona. Let me explain to you all what lunch is like in Barcelona, everybody. You go to lunch at around 1 o'clock, maybe more like 12:30, and you have 3 courses. It's your main meal of the day, and then you get a bottle of wine. You have a bottle of wine at lunch. This was regular work lunch. And then Gabriel's right. You go home, you take a little siesta, and then you get back to work again, and you finish around 7. Now, American companies, when they set up shop in Spain, they have a choice. Are you going to adopt that model? Or how about the American model, where you have a half-hour lunch, maybe an hour, maybe you work through lunch? We'll still end at 7. You know what I mean? So I don't know what y'all think about the Barcelona model of lunch. Did I mention it's delicious? I was in Barcelona last year. It was incredibly good food.
I think part of the problem, it is cultural, but I don't think we really talked about like why we work so hard and why like younger people are working harder than ever, because like it just costs so much to be a living person who maybe wants to live in a house and maybe wants to own a car and maybe wants to eat healthy, that we have to work a lot harder than people who, I don't know, like in the 80s you could go to college for like $2,000, but it's a lot different, obviously.
Why does it cost so much? Now, you've mentioned college. What else are you worried about?
Rent, and just the fact that like people in the industry that we're in never want to pay us. So we have to work a lot harder. If you want a car, if you want all these other things that like our parents had, that boomers have, for a lot less. It just doesn't seem fair.
Can you get by without a car?
If you live in a city, maybe.
Could you imagine a way of living where you don't have those expenses? Or as many of them? What if I told you, for example, that you can buy a house in Detroit for $5,000, which is actually accurate?
What kind
Yeah,
of
but it's not
neighborhood is that house in?
$5,000.
Is it made of pine wood or oak?
It's the average.
What
It's
kind of neighborhood is
in
it?
some pretty decent areas, actually. You could move to a city that's more affordable, like Dayton, Akron, right?
Ugh.
You could move to a small
Sorry,
town.
anybody from Ohio.
Listen, Laurel, I'm just playing devil's advocate with you here. I'm trying to enter into a question to a point that Ghosh makes later in the reading. So, but just bear with me. Like, I hear you, right? Life in suburban Baltimore, where I live, it's pricey. And I have kids. Maybe that wasn't a smart choice. They cost an arm and a leg. I look at my friends who don't have kids and I'm sometimes jealous. Rents are expensive in Baltimore. They're worse in Washington. They're less in York, Pennsylvania. You need a car, certain areas for sure. Depends. It depends. See, it depends on your choices. It depends where you want to live and how you want to live, right? You know what I mean? I'm not saying all these choices are the choices I would make.
I would argue that maybe, especially for people in our field, it very much matters where you live, and that freedom is sort of taken away. Like my community is here in Baltimore. Like I would not have the same success if I was living in the middle of Pennsylvania or somewhere, or Ohio. Like I'm thriving more here financially than I would elsewhere.
Gotcha. But an environmentalist would ask the question, how can you live in Baltimore sustainably? Can you live without a car? How can you live without a car? Can you grow your own food? How can you grow your own food, right? Ideally, the kind of sustainable choices we make would also be affordable, right? And I don't know the answer to that question. It often is going to vary from person to person. I know people who live in Baltimore and don't have cars.
There's
couldn't do it.
I lived in Reservoir Hill for a year, which was really interesting because what they've done is they've been able to knock down a lot of the vacant homes and then set up community gardens. So we have like a little cornfield, and there was there's all this stuff different growing. Additionally, a lot of people owned electric scooters there. And this is not we're not talking this. Reservoir Hill is not wealthy at all. My rent was very cheap. Um, and there still were a number of abandoned properties around. But that gave me a little bit of hope, which is that instead of trying to attract people to come back or remodel these homes as luxury condos, just knock them down and turn them into farming, urban farming areas. Even if it doesn't sustain the population, it gives people something to do and at least gives a fraction,
Which is happening in Detroit, right? I don't know if you guys know about this, but there's acres and acres of empty land in Detroit, and they're actually turning it back into farmland. I don't really know much about Detroit. I've been there once, but I read about it with great interest because it is such an fascinating urban experiment. It is a big city in America. It has about 1 million people, which is insanely affordable. There have been many artists who moved out there. Um, to what I would say to Laurel about where you have to be for your work, it also depend on your medium. Um, there was for a long time, painters and sculptors wanted giant warehouses or lofts. And Baltimore was an attractive destination for a while because we have a lot of abandoned industrial facilities. Um, Not always in the safest parts of town, but they're cheap and available. And Detroit has a ton, you know. Yeah, Gabriel mentions Wham City. Detroit has a ton of these spaces. Now, I don't know, what is your major, Laurel? Are you graphic design?
No, I'm a painter.
Oh, you are.
Yeah.
Then my example doesn't work. But I was going to say, well, listen, in a way, your practice is the kind of thing you can pick up and move, but you already indicated you have a network of people you work with and work for, and that's not to be undermined. I mean, I hear you completely, Once upon a time, graphic designers had to be in New York City. When I arrived at MICA 15 years ago, I don't know if you guys know this. When you graduate, you're going to get an exit survey. And one of the questions of the exit survey is, where are you going to go? And when I arrived 15 years ago, everybody was going to New York, right? And nobody was staying in Baltimore. It was like, I'm getting out of here. Now it's flipped. No one's going to New York anymore. And people are like, Baltimore seems pretty good, because it's relatively affordable. Baltimore is the last affordable big city on the East Coast. Although I do think Philadelphia has some advantages as well. But any case, I've been blabbing. Let's see what we got here in the chat. Gabriel Ches, I want you to explain yourself. I would like to live in a city without a car, but it's less to do about sustainability. It's more to do for entire corporations to change their energy practices.
It's the whole thing with how Shell Oil bankrolled the entire personal sustainability project, like where you're guilted into having to, like, what are you doing for the environment? How are you are you sorting your stuff into compost or not? Like, are you conscious of how long your showers take? Sure, that does have an effect, but it's so minuscule in comparison to what to any small amount of regulations you can put on those companies. And it was all bankrolled by corporations like Shell at the same time as them bankrolling climate denialism.
Yeah.
It puts the personal responsibility on people. Responsibilitation. We talked about this earlier in the year.
I agree 100%. That's basically why I said that.
You want to expand, Gabriel Ches?
I mean, yeah, I feel like to a certain extent you can at the individual level, like if everybody did that type of stuff. No, it's okay. That's like you said it better than I could. Right?
Don't say that, but
but yeah, everything to do with responsibilization. I think regulation and having these energy sources change and be upgraded for the future right now for sustainability is one of the number one things we could do. And for people to be asking you to when a corporation, like a gas company or I don't know, like a water company gives you a timer for your shower, it's like, oh, make sure you have a shower for 6 minutes. It's it just seems so pandering and so yeah.
So is it kind of like this, Gabriel Ches? This is what I'm doing, but what are you doing, corporations? Right? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny. I think of this issue with respect to electric cars, right? You know, the electric cars is a technology that's here, right? It's ready. The problem is the wider infrastructure is not entirely there, right? Micah is lucky we have, well, maybe 2 outlets. That's probably not very much, but we have 2 outlets to plug a car in. On the 95 the other day, driving to New York, well, this was actually a couple months ago, I saw a whole host of plugins for cars, you know. Now I start to see these. And that is corporate America, you know, coming along. These are the big infrastructure changes we need, right? And I see what you're saying, Gabriel. You know, yeah, we've been told forever, do what you can on an individual level, but it's hard to see how much we can do when this really requires a big reaction, you know. Let me make 2 points here. You know, so I didn't finish that last point from earlier about Amitav Ghosh saying, you know, that that climate change fails to grip the political imaginary, and why it fails to grip it is because we have been told and prompted forever by this capitalist system to think about individuals. We think about in terms of individuals, and we think about ourselves as individuals, what we need, and we are not prone to thinking about the collective. So it's the individual versus the collective. And the problem here is that climate change is not the kind of issue that can simply be, you know, tackled through individual effort. It's a collective problem. In fact, it's bad. It's a global problem. And now we're talking about 7.5 billion people, right? Or at least the countries that involve this massive population, they have to be mobilized here. This is no easy effort, right? This is very difficult. And painting the picture further, as he points out, you know, he's writing from India, and he points out the countries in what he calls the global south. They feel it is unjust for them to be making the cuts. The cuts should come from the global north, which are the principal emitters, and he's not wrong. But also the global south feels like we just, you know, we're just getting our industries going, you know, and now this idea of cuts is coming. It's very difficult. It's understandable why certain countries are not going to want to, they're not going to be, you know, easy. They won't easily agree to the Paris climate change agreement, for example, right? Different countries have different agendas. They have different grievances. So this is a very messy thing, and it is easy to feel resigned amidst it all, right? This is where we return to Gloria's question, like, who's going to solve this? Because I can't do anything myself, right? Anybody want to chime in right there? Which is why he comes to an interesting question here, interesting point, this on page 135. Let me see if I can find it. Here's what he says, middle of the page, 135. Climate change is often described as a wicked problem. One of its wickedest aspects is that it may require us to abandon some of our most treasured ideas about political virtue. For example, be the change you want to see. What we need instead is to find a way out of the individualizing imaginary in which we are trapped. When future generations look back upon the great derangement, which is, by that term, I guess he means how we got carried away by this capitalist frenzy and endanger the world. When future generations look back upon the great derangement, they will certainly blame the leaders and the politicians of this time for their failure to address the climate crisis. But they may well hold artists and writers to be equally culpable. For the imagining of possibilities is not, after all, the job of politicians and bureaucrats. Right? As a writer, he's putting himself on the spot, but he's also implicating you all, which is, artists help people imagine, they help the public imagine possibilities. And the possibility we require here now is that we need to transcend the bounds of individualism, in order to think collectively, to think in terms of the common good. We need to be able to think in terms of the common good, as opposed to, in English, we say, looking out for number one. This is a saying. And what this means is, looking out for myself, right? How do we identify with common good? That's really the issue. Anybody have any comments or questions about that?
I think it's not, I won't say impossible, but it's a very hard thing to unify people under one specific goal, because there's always going to be people with like ulterior motives, or there are going to be people who try to benefit from it for their own like interpretations of it. Like even if you have people who agree on a certain thing, they won't agree on why it's a thing or who made it or whatever. They'll like cannibalize each other. So it's not an impossibility. It's just hard to imagine it being successful.
Yeah, I mean, what we're talking about here is, philosophers use the term paradigm shift. Oh gosh, I misspelled that. Excuse me. Paradigm shift. This is an essential. He's calling for nothing less than an essential, fundamental change in values. We are programmed to look out for ourselves. We're programmed to think about what we can do. And we're not inclined to think ourselves as related, like in the way that Jenny Odell says it. We're not inclined to think of ourselves as connected, as bound up with other things and other people, right? And this is a fundamental shortcoming we're going to have to overcome. Anybody else? Anybody have any thoughts on?
I feel like one of the issues that happens with this kind of stuff is that we usually use, in my opinion, I feel like we use the wrong rhetoric to try and get these certain types of people to actually do things. Because, you see it even with what's happening right now in COVID, where it's like if we're all like, oh, well, we'll help everyone if everyone wears a mask. And a lot of the people who don't wear masks just don't give a shit. So it's just like, well, like you should be like, so like you change the rhetoric so that it's only focused about them benefiting themselves, because a lot of people here in America are very selfish. So if you cater to that selfishness, then you'll probably change their mind. But the other hard problem is that you have to do it in a way that doesn't sound like you're demeaning them either, or you're trying to tell them what to do, because then they'll think like, oh, well, you just think you're better than me, and then they won't want to do it either. So it's like you have to do like 5D chess, doing like reverse psychology with the person, and then they'll like do it.
5G chess, that's funny. You raise an excellent example, Zach. It's totally true. I have been having some tiffs with family members who are very skeptical of the public health recommendations, and I just can't get over their resistance to it. I keep thinking, don't you realize you're endangering other people? It's exactly the problem that Amitav Ghosh puts his finger on here. It's lack of appreciation for the collective good, right? I mean, come on now. A lot of the critics are saying, just as we see here with climate change, they're saying this is a problem of freedom. Freedom is endangered by the public health recommendations for COVID. okay in a way. That what freedom? The freedom to be individually reckless? Is that it? I mean, what about the freedom of other people to live without the disease, right? Oh yeah, Laurel, let them have it. You know, it is crazy, it really, this story, this example really brings to the fore how, at least in America, we have such a hard time thinking in terms of the collective well-being. You know, I don't think there are a few other countries on the planet that have this problem. How do you convince those people who just won't listen? I don't know. You got to wear your mask, Rashad, anyway. Well, I'm thinking about the disease. Climate change.
Yeah, I'm at like in the bigger, like I'm towards, more like towards climate change, or like, I mean, just in general, but yeah.
I
Like,
mean, my opinion on climate change is, unfortunately, the political, and I'm thinking more in terms of the United States, is that the political engine has gotten so stuck. You know, it's very difficult. I mean, I was going to share with you all this article about, you know, how President Biden is going to make climate change his main cause. And basically, he's going to be barred from any kind of major legislation. And the reason he's going to be barred from major legislation is because, A, he may not have the Senate. We'll have to see what happens with those seats in Georgia. But even if he does, the
All it takes is one senator to have hold the over all for other 49 to get like one thing in the bill that they want.
Right. And, you know, you still, without, because we have a filibuster in Congress, if you want significant legislation to pass, what would that be? Say, for example, a carbon tax. If you wanted that to pass, you need 60 votes. And the Republicans, because of our partisanship is so strong right now, the Republicans are not going, they're going to be obstructionist. So what they're anticipating is that Biden is going to have to do this through what is called executive action. And he's going to basically overturn the rule changes that Trump made across the board. He's going to reimpose regulations, but he's also going to um, put climate change, make climate change action part of the job of various agencies. So, for example, the Department of Agriculture is now going to have some missions that involve. They're going to be giving subsidies, for example, to farmers who sequester carbon, right? Things like that. And the SEC, which deals with regulating the stock market, there may be new laws that give, you know, tax breaks to companies that promote sustainable business. It's going to be like that, but it's not going to be through major action. So this is my way of saying, I think principally this is probably either going to, you know, the changes that are going to come with climate change, what I mean is a serious response is going to come either from countries other than the United States. I think countries in Asia and in Europe, they look like they are probably going to have the best ability to mobilize against climate change. But in America, I think it's largely going to be the private sector, you know. And listen, there is reason for some optimism, right? On the one hand, electric cars are becoming more common, and we're very soon, maybe we're on the precipice maybe of a revolution when it comes to electric cars. And solar energy and wind energy are slowly but surely becoming much more affordable, you know, and much more available. So, you know, it's interesting. There was an article a few years ago pointing out that, you know, despite all that President Trump was doing to foil, you know, the environmental movement, plenty of sustainable actions were moving along because the market was already anticipating the future. Trump, in other words, Trump was not the future. And here's a classic example. Trump wanted to roll back the Obama administration's, Obama had said that, right, we need certain fuel efficiency standards for cars, and it was very high. And Trump came in and he said he rolled them back. Guess what happened? The car companies didn't change because they said, well, it's tempting, but the future, climate change is in our future. And so we're going to go ahead and stick to those higher fuel efficiency standards anyway. So that's kind of encouraging, and maybe that's a little bit of hope for what you're talking about, Gabriel Ches. These are the corporations that are on board. I mean, even the gas companies, the gas and oil companies, we know that Exxon and Shell, they're all working on sustainable energy as well. They've invested billions of dollars because they know that sooner or later they will have to pivot. It's just it's not a question of if, but when. And by the way, this year has been very devastating for the oil companies. Their stock has plummeted, in part because demand is very low, right? You and I, we're all sitting at our desks talking. We're not driving places, the future of the oil industry has kind of come crashing down, and they're realizing that they may have to change their business model sooner rather than later.
I was going to say negative oil prices seem like forever ago, but that actually happened.
What are you referring to?
In the futures market, where futures contracts for oil, was it in March, went negative because speculators couldn't actually. There was no there's nowhere to stock or store the oil because all the reserves are already full. And so speculators, in order to avoid going to court to get rid of their contracts, were selling. We're trying to give people money to get their contract for oil to go pick up the oil. So essentially, yeah.
One of the reasons that the oil companies were so stubborn in not admitting climate change is because I don't know how familiar you guys are with this, but when you develop an oil field, that is an extremely long and expensive investment. And the oil companies had literally sunk billions and billions and billions of dollars in these assets that were not yet tapped. Well, what this experience with COVID has actually prompted the companies to do is to abandon some of those future oil developments. They are walking away from these assets. We call these stranded assets. So that is a pretty remarkable change that I happen to be kind of encouraged by. But it'll be really interesting to see what 2021 looks like. What kind of consumer habits are we going to turn back to? I don't know. Right, and Gabriel Ches points out that, other countries are building these sustainable technologies. I know, for example, China is way far ahead in terms of wind turbines, and there are American companies that are working on this because they know that is a competitive field going forward. But listen, they'd be doing a lot better if they had government support and, as in the past, there are plenty of industries in this country that have succeeded because of government support, like the automotive industry. The sustainable energy industry in this country has kind of had to go on its own. So, yeah, good. Anybody want to say anything else at this point about any questions or comments about any of this business? Oh, yeah, I remember Trump saying that about the windmills. There are a lot of different types of windmills, right, that are being developed. I've seen some really funky ones. You can find them because they know this is a problem for some birds. There are a lot of different options for the future, right, in terms of energy resources. Algae is another source. There's a company based in Maryland, actually. They are developing devices that can extract energy from the waves of the ocean, and you could be going about like on your boat and you'll see this like blob in the water. And as it rises and falls with the waves, it is, it's collecting energy, What do we do if it's not windy? Well, the big issue is battery power, right? This is what everybody's talking about right now. Countries, I was reading about this in The Economist the other day. Britain, England has a lot of solar power and a lot of wind power, but they don't yet have the capacity to store it for times when it is not windy or sunny. And if you've been in England, is often not sunny. So what are you going to do? So storage is the big issue that they will. I mean, when it comes to coal and natural gas, that's not a problem because we can burn that whenever we need more energy. But storage is the future. There's plenty of ways to get the energy, but storage is the future. So
some really cool storage techniques in areas that have sort of elevation changes. And that one of the most efficient ways to build a battery is to essentially have two lake beds, and one is at a higher elevation than the other. And your battery is essentially using the energy to pump the water up to that top lake. And so at nighttime, that goes down, and then it sort of spins the turbine. And that doesn't involve mining any lithium or any of that stuff. I thought that was so clever when I learned about that.
it requires a little bit of geography. You need some
Yeah.
land, but we're going to have to learn how to live more economically and efficiently on the land that we have, right? No more sprawl. Got to live in more compact areas. Gloria, how are we being arrogant? What did you have in mind?
Well, I just think that I don't really like to say this to like a group of American students.
Bring it.
I'm Chinese, and I've seen like how the tension between Chinese government and the Western world in general has been really like a bad situation throughout the years. Like most of the time we are like attacking each other, and I know we Chinese government has a really tough diplomatic officials. Like recently, the Australia soldier. There's an illustration on Twitter that was posted by one of our officials, and like Australian government are requesting apology from us because we post a criticism over something the crime that their soldiers has been done, and there are like a bunch of Western media just comes out and say we support Australia because well it has been really I just feel it's wrong that the Western media attacking Chinese government because we are Chinese and we should just lay our heads down and listen to a Western word. That just doesn't make any sense. And because we criticize that they're a crime, and like now everyone is attacking the Chinese government and pull out a lot of hilarious conspiracy, and it just Western world just makes everyone feels it's wrong being a Chinese, and like we have no human rights in China, which is absolutely nonsense. And it's just like how the Western world portray my government is just so different from what I've been lived for like my entire life, and what I've been seeing my whole life.
Are you seeing that in relation to climate change as well, as we've been discussing?
Well, I mean, we don't have, I don't like for climate change. We put more focus on like pollution. What I've been seeing over the years is we are encouraging citizens to buy the sort of like electronic cars. So
Mhm,
like there's less gas emissions to
mhm,
the air, and honestly, for pollution over years, that there's definitely more it's better than it used to be, because like when I was 12, I still remember there was absolutely just like blurry fog out there.
mm,
We can see people literally stand next to me on the playground. That's how I remember that.
mm,
And now that the air is up, definitely cleaner than it used to be. So I guess the government has been definitely doing their job to like help like our nation, but like talking about the cooperation with the world, that's like probably less.
mm. Well, there are actually a lot of people who believe that China is going to take the lead on this issue on climate change. And they feel that they're going to take the lead because they're uniquely positioned to do so. On the one hand, China has been dealing with some rather extreme pollution, as you just indicated, the smog and the air quality. And the Chinese government is very aware of those problems that have come about from rapid industrialization. But as you've also indicated, China is able to mobilize people and the government to uh, to um, to combat these issues very quickly. Um, and this leads to my second point. China, because of the nature of its government, may be uniquely positioned to take care of this issue precisely because it is not as messy a democracy as the United States is. Right? It can move quickly. Uh, and the Chinese population seems to have a greater sense of collective duty and obligation. And actually, we see this in their response to COVID, right? The United States, Americans didn't respond this way. We were all over the place, right? And that is precisely the problem. That's precisely the change that is needed, according to Amitav Ghosh, is that right? We have got to think in terms of a collective sensibility, as opposed to being fragmented uh, as individuals. That's not the way to tackle this. It's got to be in terms of the common good. Okay, so thank you for your comments. That speaks to that issue for sure. I think. Anybody else want to chime in? Yeah, and Laurel, what you raise is actually true. That I saw this early on in the pandemic. That as there's as actually I saw it pointed out this way, as there is less and less wilderness, because thanks to climate change, people are developing more land. There's fewer wild areas, or wild areas are, you know, degraded. um, that is where we come into contact with more and more viruses that then will leap species, right? So that is actually a problem, um, for sure, related to it. Let me tie things together here. Um, on the issue of this point that this is a collective response, and how can we engineer this? Uh, Ghosh is pretty negative. He points out on page, although not completely, I'm going to end on a good note, as I always try to do. He points out on page 145, 146 that, the kind of sacrifices that are required of us in the rich countries are big. He quotes a guy who says that we need to make 90% cuts in our consumption. I don't know. I don't know what that would look like. I urge you to think about that in your own life, what that would look like. I'm not sure. Um, you know, and so he considers that that's going to be a tough change for sure. The only thing that would motivate us to make these kind of personal sacrifices is if we're inspired, right? And how will we be inspired? At this point, Amitav Ghosh looks at two different texts, right? He looks at the text of the Paris Agreement, and he also looks at the text Laudato Si, which is one of the encyclicals. The popes in the Catholic Church write what are called encyclicals. I'm not sure I know why it's called an encyclical. I'll have to look that up. But they're you know, each pope will issue a couple of these, maybe 3 or 4 during their tenure, on issues of pressing social and moral importance. And this pope decided that the environment was a kind of issue that required our significant moral attention. And you know, when the Pope writes something like this, his audience is pretty big. There are 1 billion Catholics in the world. In terms of American politics, I think about 80 million Catholics. So this is a big block. Our incoming president, Joe Biden, is Catholic. But what he likes about this is the language of, you know, of shared sacrifice, right? This is truly different. This is on page 159 and 160 that this comes up. But of course, you know, what is unique about how the Pope writes about this is that he relates the issue of environmental degradation to social justice and our link to the poor, between the rich and the poor, and our obligation to the poor all around the world, right? And this kind of language, he argues, is precisely the kind of mindset change that we need, right? Religion, love it or hate it, has successfully inspired masses of people in the past to make precisely the kind of moral change that we're talking about here, switching from, you know, an individual agenda to a collective agenda and a collective good. And I'll just tie this together with a very concrete point about American politics. You know, just thinking in terms of, you know, the numbers in America, if, you know, the Catholic vote is considered a swing, we call it a swing vote. They're kind of in the middle. They tend to go, you know, Catholics historically in the last, I think, 50 years, they have tended to, the majority vote for the present, whoever it is who wins, which means is when they swing, they tend to swing, their swing raises the issue or candidate to victory. They're kind of a crucial middle voting block. And so, you know, if more and more American Catholics can be convinced by the Pope that this is the climate change is a pressing moral and religious issue. It's an issue of religious import. That you cannot be a good Christian unless you think about how your behavior as a consumer impacts other people around the world. If more and more people think that way, then that is slowly going to edge this into, you know, climate change into being an issue that people can rally around. And, you know, I've seen in my limited experience, I have seen, you know, pretty important paradigm shifts. They can happen. They can happen pretty quickly. So on one hand, it's easy to be down about the state of climate activism right now or climate belief, but things change and things can change quickly. And I always turn to the example of marriage equality and gay marriage. I remember in 2004, that was a lightning rod issue that politicians never dared mention because it was so divisive. And here we are now 16 years later, and marriage equality is generally considered a merited right, a deserved right and unquestionable right by a majority of Americans. That happened in the blink of an eye, right? So things can change and they can change quickly, but they change quickly according to our valuation and our orientation, you know. And yeah, I'm just going to pause there for a second, see if anybody has anything they want to say at this point. Anybody have any questions or comments about any of this business? All right. Well, I am going to leave it there because I see what time it is and let y'all go do your thing. Okay. So I will talk to you all. I'll meet you all next week, right? Individual paper conferences. Please sign up. I will see you the week after again. We'll reconvene one last time just to discuss the course as a whole. And in the meantime, you need to email me. Next few days, you need to email me about your paper topics, okay? And I'm going to stick around now for a few minutes because I think some people want to talk to me. Okay. I will see you all later. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
I think I can just email you later because I want to think about it a little bit more.
Sure, do that. Do that. We can set up a time to talk anytime.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, Gia.
Hi.
Oh, wait, Cindy. Hello? I don't know what's going on with Cindy.